They unfolded over the past 24 hours. Families shattered, hearts heavy, people still in disbelief, and many questions still unanswered.
We have a breaking story, though.
Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City. It happened just a few moments ago, apparently. We have very little information available.
It's quite terrifying. I'm in shock right now. It's mind-boggling, and it's horrifying.
A hijacked American Airlines flight out of Boston slams into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center at approximately 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it? I can see it on this shot.
A second airplane, a 727, just ran into the building.
It's now approximately 9:03 a.m.
Oh, my God! Oh! Forget about the damn car. Let's go.
It felt just a few moments ago like there was an explosion of some kind here at the Pentagon.
9:40 a.m., a third hijacked plane, an American flight out of Washington Dulles, crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
The FAA has banned all takeoffs at all airports across America.
We just saw a live picture of what seemed to be a portion of the building falling away from the World Trade Center.
9:59 a.m. The until now unthinkable. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses.
Spent the year in combat. I never saw anything like this. Sure, a lot of people died, but nothing this devastating.
The other tower of the World Trade Center has just collapsed.
There's been a declaration of war by terrorists in the United States.
You didn't have time to look at, you just running for your life, really.
There was smoke everywhere and people are jumping out the windows.
The city of New York in the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists.
We will find the people responsible for these cowardly acts, and justice will be done.
These are Palestinian celebrations in the wake of Tuesday's terror attacks in the United States. Apparently, Palestinians took to the street chanting, "God is great."
The alleged mastermind, America's most wanted terrorist, Osama bin Laden.
Back. Gotta move back.
Certainly in more than 20 years of covering horrific events, this is something that I've never seen before.
I got hold of a video camera and began recording, some of what had happened.
We're looking at those images right now.
Yeah.
So you're looking through your viewfinder watching the tower collapse.
Yeah, and you can see I'm not very far away. I mean, you see that big chunk of the building, and this cloud starts moving real fast.
We were all crying, hysterical. We were wanting to get out of there and not knowing where to go and which direction to run in and how far we can go. And I'm still worried about my life. Yeah, it's horrifying.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong.
This is wild.
Through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
This is an NBC News special report. Attack on America. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is day 2 of America's war with terrorists, a war against a shadowy and cold-blooded enemy willing to kill anyone to advance their cause. This is the destruction in New York City alone. The twin trade towers of the World Trade Center collapsing completely, trapping thousands of people in the rubble as the rescue efforts continue. They'll go on for an indeterminate length of time. No one knows for sure how many people may be alive. No one can say how many people may in fact be dead, but the numbers are in the thousands. And that's the USS George Washington. It's off the coast of Long Island. It is providing military support and air cover for the eastern seaboard. The president today did in fact use the phrase, "We are at war with these terrorists."
This is a News 4 special report, Attack on America.
Good afternoon, everyone. We want to bring you up to speed on what's happening locally. Officials say there are no more survivors expected to be pulled from the wreckage at the Pentagon, where American Airlines Flight 77 from Dulles to L.A. crashed yesterday. There were some jarred nerves about an hour ago when an unidentified aircraft was in the area over the Pentagon. It turned out to be a plane belonging to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which didn't have the correct codes for today. Meanwhile, employees who work in the undamaged parts of the Pentagon did return to their jobs today. Savannah Guthrie joins us now live with the latest from the Pentagon. Savannah?
Well, Susan, just to confirm what you've told our viewers, it was a close call, but actually just a false alarm here today, causing the evacuation at the Pentagon. We found out that it was a plane that was indeed friendly, but even civilians here, and there are quite a few who have come just to see what is going on here, were asked to move back. So for a moment there, it was, frankly, a little bit scary. Well, the latest thing we want to tell you is that the smoke that had been pouring out of the Pentagon for most of the afternoon, most of the morning, has now appeared to have cleared out, which makes us think that the fire has finally been put out, or at least very much under control. As late as just about an hour or two ago, you could still see the white clouds of smoke. We could actually breathe it here, very uncomfortable, giving you an idea just of the kind of working conditions that rescue workers are under right now. Meanwhile, search and rescue effort does go on, but it is very slow. It is very delicate. The place rescuers would most like to reach, that impact point, is just simply too unstable, too dangerous.
Search and rescue teams have been in since yesterday morning. The USAR team, has made initial assessments and is at present getting ready for a more comprehensive entry. That's part of what's associated with what we have to do with that middle section where the plane entered. Until the building becomes stabilized there, we won't continue to put people in the adjacent areas.
Live picture at the Pentagon, you see some workers in a cherry picker right now trying to get into the the victims that may still be inside, and obviously time is of the essence. They are racing against time right now. The longer any survivors are inside there, the more hopeless the situation becomes. So they want to protect themselves, but they want to get in there as soon as possible. Should tell you that search and rescue crews from Fairfax County and Montgomery County have been able to get into some of the adjacent areas to the impact point, and they've checked all 5 floors of one of the outermost rings of the Pentagon, and they confirmed to us that they have found bodies. They will not identify anyone for us and will not give us any numbers, although, as has been reported many times, though unconfirmed, some officials say the death toll here at the Pentagon could go as high as 800 people. And should mention one more thing to you. The Pentagon has set up a family assistance center at the Sheraton Crystal City for people who have loved ones who are missing. They are encouraged to go there for information, for support, but want to emphasize it really is just for close loved ones of people who may be still inside the Pentagon. Reporting live, I'm Savannah Guthrie. Back to you.
All right, Savannah, we should add that the latest estimates of the dead at the Pentagon have been revised down considerably, although we aren't getting any hard and fast statistics. The latest information is that there could be more than 100 dead at the Pentagon. Still don't have those numbers definitively. Meanwhile, the streets of the district remain fully patrolled after yesterday's attacks. More than 1,600 D.C. police officers are working today. Chief Charles Ramsey says there have been no problems, and police are responding to calls as normal. It is business as usual along the commercial sections of Georgetown. Officers are also working closely with uniformed Secret Service agents, U.S. Park Police, and other federal authorities. Uniformed federal officers can be seen on street corners near federal buildings. The police department has also assigned dozens of police academy cadets to various law enforcement tasks. Many of these cadets have been moved to locations downtown where you can see them in their dark blue uniforms. They are not carrying weapons. The D.C. National Guard and military police from the Maryland National Guard are also being deployed in the city. They're involved in traffic control as well as helping with security sweeps near some buildings. All MPD personnel are working 12-hour shifts. The city remains under a state of emergency. Tight security is the rule today at government buildings throughout the D.C. area. At the Transportation Department, workers were given a memo spelling out that any visitors must be escorted through the building by a representative of the person they came to see. Reporters arriving to cover a news conference at the building in Southwest were not only handed visitor passes, but also a special press credential to wear. Parking around that area severely restricted. Joining us right now is Glenn Schoon, who is a terrorism expert who works for private companies on security issues. And among the many people he's been monitoring is Osama bin Laden, who has emerged as the primary suspect, though that has not been confirmed. You believe there are some historic dates that people need to be aware of, that these attacks have a reason for their timing.
That's right, Susan. When we have one of these incidents, we immediately try to look for what is the larger context of this event. Why did it happen now? Who might be involved? What are the issues of the day playing? And in this particular case, we have two very important key dates. One occurred yesterday on the day of the attack. That was the 11th of September, 1978, when the Camp David peace accords were signed. And the significance there is that it was the first peace treaty between an Arab country and Israel. The second date is actually tomorrow, and that's the anniversary, the 8th anniversary of the Israeli-Palestinian peace accords. And we look at these as potentially important factors in terms of why this attack took place at this time. We think that likely if it was Osama bin Laden or one of the groups associated, was probably looking at staging this attack using the prism of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and what the Palestinians see as too much American support for Israel.
And these were days of optimism in this country and among our allies when we thought there might be some end in sight or the beginning of a peace in the Middle East problem, not seen that way by Arab extremists.
You are absolutely correct. The first date, the Arab peace accords, were seen as a major defeat for Arab nationalists and people who would like to see Israel either destroyed or marginalized, or who wanted to break the links between Israel and the United States, seen as its big main foreign military backer. And in the case of the Israeli PLO accords, of course, we have had groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas have long undertaken actions, particularly in Israel itself, to try and sabotage that accord and sabotage the peace.
Many of us are afraid. Many of us want to know what, if anything, can be done to stop this kind of attack. When you see those planes flying into the buildings, everyone felt so helpless. You advise corporations on terrorism, and you say that you look at the preventive end of it. Is there anything we can do to help protect us against this kind of act of terrorism?
Well, there's a lot of things we can do, and we do them at very different levels. The government, companies, travel companies, aviation companies, the airline industry, a lot of people are working in very different ways, optimizing security, working with our allies overseas, trying to improve our intelligence collection, trying to straighten out our policies, bilateral treaties, bilateral extradition agreements with other countries, so that when we do catch a suspect or identify one, we can bring that person back or bring that person to justice quicker. One of the things that we're concerned about for the longer term here is what this may mean if this is bin Laden and some of his associates who are behind this attack, if they are doing this in effect playing into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's their viewpoint on this, that they're helping the Palestinians, that they're taking a pan-Arab approach of support for the Palestinians, that we may well see more activity in the future directed specifically against the United States.
Now, if it's not Osama bin Laden, might we be overlooking some other likely suspect?
It's certainly possible. The thing to remember about Osama bin Laden is that above all, he is a symbolic figure. He does lead actual groups, and he leads an umbrella organization, this so-called Al-Qaeda group, which means the base in Arabic. But the bottom line point is he draws in members of all sorts of different groups, from Egypt, from Somalia, from Pakistan, from countries all around the planet. And one of his strengths is that he works with so many groups and has the opportunity to allow these players and develop these players to act against us. And we might just mainly be focusing on what he is doing and the leadership of his group is doing, but meanwhile there's a lot of decentralized control, so a lot of these groups can take the initiative. And it's very difficult for us. We're now dealing with enemies as varied as people sometimes from Senegal or Somalia or the Sudan or Pakistan or the Philippines. We're not just looking like we were with earlier bouts of Middle Eastern terrorism for people from specific countries.
Making it much more difficult to address. Thank you so much for being with us, Glenn Schoon. We are going to certainly be following this in the hours to come. We'll be back with a local news update at the top of the hour. We were going to rejoin network programming now.
Know that if there ever were time to avoid retaliation and do something cooperatively with Osama bin Laden, that moment is now. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. As we continue to watch the situation in Boston, we're beginning to get more names that are being released by the airlines, but the news continues not to be good out of the World Trade Center area, where they continue to search for bodies and for people who may still be alive. There were reports last night that some people were on their cell phones trying to tell searchers where they were at that time. Some better news, however, in Washington today in terms of the death toll at the Pentagon. At one point last night, we were told that as many as 800, mostly military personnel, had been killed when the airliner was driven into the side of the Pentagon yesterday morning, shortly after the attack on the World Trade Center. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski is there for us again today. Jim, what is the latest on the count there?
Well, Tom, according to Pentagon officials, the latest death toll here at the Pentagon appears to be just over 100. Some 40 to 50 Army personnel, both military and civilian. Some 40 to 50 Army or Navy, again, civilian and military, and approximately 7 defense intelligence employees, all civilians, according to officials here in the Pentagon. There was some confusion here yesterday. That entire area that was hit by this airliner yesterday is an area in transition. A lot of people moving into offices, out of offices. And so when everybody scattered, it was difficult to keep track. And it wasn't until this morning, when people started to report back to work, that they actually started to get a much better number on those still missing. And they've narrowed it down to approximately 100 or 107 they hope, anyway, at the maximum. But they say that it will take at least a week before rescue workers and recovery operations can really be concluded in that region, because the area is still so unstable. It's a danger to rescue workers, and because some fires continue to burn there. In fact, a short time ago, Tom, they put out an alert and were ready to evacuate the entire building because a hot spot had occurred in the roof above us. But then they got that contained, and they decided we could stay. But very unstable in that entire section, so it's going to be some time before we get any kind of exact casualty count out of there. But we are told that notification of next of kin has already begun, and perhaps Secretary Rumsfeld himself will talk to us later this afternoon to give us that information. Tom?
All right, thanks, NBC's Jim Miklaszewski. We have on the telephone now our Justice Department correspondent, Pete Williams, who was in the backcountry of the American West when all of this happened. He's now in Denver, and he's been working the telephones. He did report to us that material witness warrants have been issued. They're beginning to pick up people who refuse to cooperate with investigators. Pete, you expect that we're going to see more incidents like the one that we're witnessing right now in Boston?
Yes, Tom. Federal law enforcement officials say we're going to see a lot of this in the coming days. People taken into custody, anyone who has any potential connection with the suspected terrorists, for whom the authorities wish to keep track of, and they may want to ask them additional questions. Anyone who isn't completely cooperative with agents will probably be arrested on material witness warrants. We saw a lot of this similar kind of thing, although certainly not on this scale, in the days and weeks leading up to the millennium, when after the Ahmed Rissam came across the border with a car full of explosives, and immediately the FBI and other law enforcement officials began to try to figure out how extensive this potential terrorist network was. and they were making these material witness warrants all over the country, knocking on doors, going up alleys into apartments all over the country, and we're going to be seeing this probably on a much bigger scale in the coming days, authorities say. Now, they caution us to say that even as they make these arrests, we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that these people necessarily are connected to the terror plot, that it could be they're simply people who are, for whatever reasons, not being cooperative. And it's possible, they say, that some of these people could ultimately be released if it turns out they have no connection. So they caution us to not jump to any conclusions as we watch these arrests being made.
All right, Pete Williams in Denver, what else can you tell us about the nature of the investigation? Is this going on not just in this country but around the world as well? Are they asking international authorities to cooperate with us?
Absolutely, although obviously the FBI's power to make arrests is considerably different overseas. Anyone they wanted to detain, they'd have to get host nation cooperation to do that, and I don't get any indication that they're near that at this point.
But we do have many outposts overseas. That was established under Louis Freeh, who did have this grave concern about an international network of terrorism directed at this country.
That's right. We heard John Ashcroft yesterday afternoon, the Attorney General, use that somewhat unfamiliar term, LEGATs, that the FBI has around the country. That's short for legal attachés, FBI agents assigned to American embassies in major cities around the world. And he already indicated last night that they're very actively going after chasing leads in their cities as well.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Pete Williams. Let's go to Boston now, and one of our crack investigative reporters, Chris Hansen of Dateline NBC. Boston, of course, is ground zero for this investigation because 2 of the planes were taken from there. Chris?
Absolutely, Tom. Good afternoon. The scene that you've been watching at the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston has been repeated to a lesser degree all over town today. From talking to investigative sources in and around the airport here, FBI agents and state police have been interviewing cab drivers who may or may not have knowledge of the people involved in this. They've been talking to baggage handlers who are familiar with perhaps some of the subjects. And federal investigators are confirming that they do believe that there is an actual terrorist cell here in the Boston area with direct links to Osama bin Laden. And that's part of what's made this such an aggressive investigation today, such a fast-moving investigation today. Officially, FBI agents here are not saying much. They're saying that the word is going to come out of Washington, but we can tell you that there are literally hundreds of investigators here at the airport talking to virtually every human being that had anything to do with the flights that took off and ultimately smashed into the World Trade Center, Tom.
Okay, NBC's Chris Hansen, who is at Logan Airport in Boston. Chris, just tell us, as a matter of other interest, of course, what happened to airport security there today?
Well, airport security is going to increase incredibly here. No longer will there be curbside baggage check-in. They're going to keep all vehicles 300 yards away from any airport building. There will be more ID checks, and only ticketed passengers will be allowed into the secure areas of the airport. There have been some other developments here, Tom, that are interesting. Reports circulating from investigators that perhaps there were 3 people who bought one-way tickets on this flight at the very last minute and boarded like perhaps 11 minutes prior to the flight. As you know, they found this vehicle here today, or rather yesterday, that has been tied to at least 2 of the suspects in the vehicle. They found flight training manuals in Arabic. They have linked this car to 2 brothers who have passports from the United Arab Emirates, and one of them is a trained pilot. They think that they are among those who were the hijackers, and there is every indication now from federal sources that they have pretty much identified all of the hijackers who took part in this on the planes, at least coming from Boston, Tom.
Thank you very much. Dateline's Chris Hansen. Now, our affiliate, WHDH in Boston, has reported that 1 person was wounded in this hotel incident, whatever it was. We just know that there was a massive show of law enforcement there. There was a van parked outside. It has since departed the hotel, but we don't know what went on inside. Again, our affiliate there is saying that they have a report that 1 person was wounded. We'll try to get that sorted out to you. There are names now attached to these hijackings, and 2 of them, Mohammed Atta and Marwan El-Shahi, that's S-H-E-H-H-I, that they took some pilot training when they were in Florida, and the pilot examiner who certified them said his records show that they were certified in November and December of the year 2000. He's still sorting out which man was certified first. They were certified in a Piper Seneca, which is a piston engine. It's a small airplane, obviously. Experienced pilots on this plane say that if you do not have to land or take off a Boeing 757 or a 767, you would likely be able to fly one of those jets after being certified in the Piper Seneca. Once those big airliners are airborne, it is not all that difficult to maneuver them, and obviously the terrorists were at the controls of those two planes that flew into the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon, and we don't know what happened to the plane that went down just outside of Philadelphia. Let's go to NBC's Ann Curry now, who is in Lower Manhattan, where the search and rescue efforts continue underway. Ann?
As you know, Tom, it is an intense search and rescue effort. I've been down here all morning, and earlier we were taken down to Ground Zero, right at Vesey and West, which is just right in front of the World Trade Center building number 1. And we saw the collateral damage is intense. Number one, building number 1 is just a couple stories, maybe even just 1 or 2 stories still standing, and behind it you can see the wreckage of building number 2. Off to the side, building number 7, as you know, is down. It was still smoking as of early this morning, and there is still some smoke coming out of it, although some of that may be simply smoldering smoke. It's gone on and off again, the fire there. And then also, we should probably tell you from having been on the scene that the collateral damage is intense. The Customs building, which is building number 6, has been severely impacted. There are buildings all around that have been severely impacted. In fact, one nearby building had a gaping hole about 3 stories high. Also, windows blown out a block and a half away. So there's been a lot of intense damage down here. Also, we should probably tell you that the rescuers are searching, doing the best they can, and finding everybody. They brought in cranes, all kinds of heavy equipment. In addition, however, they also have robotics. Robot machines. We hear some planes going overhead. I know they're police helicopters. That sounded like a military jet, military jets have been flying over this area, by the way, and the National Guard is on the scene. We've seen robotic machines that they're sending in. They brought them in this morning. They go down. They're able to go where there's so much structural damage, so much structural instability that they feel this is the only safe way to look for people who might still be alive. So what they're doing is they're sending these machines down, and these machines can send back not only images, but they can also send back information as to whether there is movement. They've also brought in infrared devices so that they can tell whether there is heat underneath the rubble. But it's a very, very intense job for them to find people who are still alive using infrared, because there's also some hot spots, as you can see. We should also tell you that this morning we have confirmed from New York Fire Department Chief, Battalion Chief Kevin Burns, confirmed to us that there was one person who was rescued this morning. He would not identify that person, whether it was a man or a woman, a rescuer or a person who was in the building, but he said that person is in the hospital and alive. And one more bit of information for you. We did also see a truck loaded with gas tanks being brought in, and when we asked what those were for, we were told that while the primary focus out here is to find people who may still be alive under this rubble, they are also efforting an attempt to find those black boxes, which were aboard, of course, both of those 2 planes that went down. They brought in the gas tank so they can fuel the device that they need to use to cut through metal that may be separating the people who need to find those black boxes from the devices themselves. So there is a very intense effort. We have since this morning been pushed back from Ground Zero, and so we're attempting to show you those pictures from above buildings and talking to whoever we can to get you more information. Tom, back to you.
All right, thanks very much. Ann Curry of NBC's Today program on duty and in the middle of it all in Lower Manhattan today, reporting on the continuing search and rescue effort that is underway there. WHDH, our affiliate in Boston. Let's listen to them for just a few moments. We did see that incident at the hotel there. They're now saying that someone has been arrested.
The few staff members who I talked to, not officials for the hotel, but the people who are just giving out information as they get it, are just saying they're under the impression that police and FBI agents are here. They've been told because there could be something that's connected to the terrorist activity of the last 36 hours or so, and that they just want to see that through. But no, nobody I've talked to has had any information that there's been any specific purpose for all of these EMS and ambulances to be standing by.
Christina, we are getting some information from our colleague at NBC, Pete Williams, who is fairly well connected, that in fact authorities are looking for, quote, potential connections to terrorists there at the Westin, that they're looking for material witnesses, and that it is one of many operations to come. However, considering the fact that apparently we do have one person injured and is about to be transported, and one person reportedly in custody, and I caution our audience that with any type of breaking news like this, with unofficial information and sometimes hearsay, we have to take all of this a bit with a grain of salt. But clearly, there's quite a bit unfolding here at the Westin right now.
Because we do have some conflicting scenes here with Christina inside the hotel.
So that is an unconfirmed report that there's been an arrest at the Westin Hotel, the Copley Hotel, which is in the heart of Boston. Logan Airport was the takeoff site, obviously, for two of the airliners that were used in yesterday's terrorist attacks, and they have identified people who went from Portland, Maine to Logan and boarded those two airplanes. And in fact, two of the men, it appears, did receive some kind of pilot training in Florida last year, in the fall of last year. Here's an intriguing development. We have in Asia, Reti Santra in Singapore. She works for CNBC. She simply dialed the foreign ministry in Kabul and asked if Osama bin Laden is still in Afghanistan. And the Taliban official said that she talked to, yes, he is. I can confirm that because I have seen him. But then he wouldn't answer further questions, saying that she would have to talk with the foreign minister himself. But he did say that Osama bin Laden is in Afghanistan. There is a Pakistani military delegation en route to Afghanistan right now, apparently with a very stern message to the Taliban, that radical and very fundamentalist Islamic group that has taken over that country and is widely believed to be harboring Osama bin Laden, the man that most people think is the chief suspect in this terrorist war that has been declared on the United States. One of America's leading journalistic authorities on that part of the world is at Newsweek magazine now. He is the Middle Eastern regional editor, an old friend of mine, Chris Dickey. We spent a fair amount of time in that part of the world. But Chris, the equation has certainly changed in the last 24 hours or so.
Nobody ever imagined anything like this. I think that's one of the great problems. The terrorists were a lot more imaginative than the people who were defending the country.
What do we know about Osama bin Laden's operation? The sophistication of it. Yesterday's very complex and, I dare say, in the darkest sense of the word, brilliantly executed terrorist attack against this country shows that he has a very wide reach.
Yeah, I think the thing that you have to recognize about yesterday's operation is the reason it worked was really what the intelligence people called tradecraft, not technology. The technology was minimal, almost non-existent, razor blades, small knives. What made this operation a success from the terrorist point of view was intelligence gathering, surveillance, making a lot of very good judgments about where vulnerabilities were that security officials were not paying much attention to, and then exploiting those to the max. And that's why we had such a disaster yesterday.
Chris, what about the reaction of the other Arab states? King Abdullah of Jordan has been on the air today saying that he condemned those small-scale celebrations in Palestine on the West Bank by the young Palestinians that upset so many Americans. But the rest of the Arab world, by and large, has been reasonably muted during all of this.
Well, I think that you have to look at differences of opinion in the Arab world. A lot of Arabs resent American support for Israel. There's no doubt about that. But they also love America, and they love Americans. I think that a lot of the initial reaction was a reaction to the striking against the symbols of American power. But I think very quickly most Arabs, the vast majority of Arabs, decided that they really could not bear the idea of so many people being killed, so many innocents being killed. I think the reaction is going to be more and more emotional and more pro-American, in fact, in the Arab world.
All right, thank you very much. Chris Dickey, who is the regional editor in the Middle East for Newsweek magazine. Thanks for sharing that with us, and we'll probably be talking to you again during the course of the next several days or so. Let's go back up to Boston now, and Dateline's Chris Hansen, who is there. There are any number of reports of some arrest or something going on in that city as law enforcement officers fan out across Boston, the home of Logan Airport, which was where two of those airliners were hijacked shortly after takeoff yesterday. Chris?
Well, as you probably know, Tom, there are a lot of connections in this area to Osama bin Laden. As we mentioned before, investigators believe that there is a true terrorist cell here with connections. But there are also just a lot of other people in the community that the investigators want to talk to see if they have any knowledge of what was going on here. These things are never carried out by a handful of people. It takes a lot of people to get something like this off the ground. And I'll give you an example of some of the things that they're pursuing today. There are a number of cab drivers who investigators think have knowledge of perhaps what was going to take place here, as well as a number of potential airport employees. And one of the questions here is that apparently there was there were a number of airport identification badges missing, perhaps as many as 800 over the last year. Investigators want to know what happened to these, who used them, and if that played any role into the tragic occurrence that we saw yesterday.
And Chris, there's that one intriguing report as well that when two of the men who are believed to have been part of this hijacking gang arrived at Logan Airport, they got into an argument with someone in the parking lot, and that man later called authorities when he heard two of the planes had been hijacked. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I sure do, Tom, and it's interesting because it seems like any time we get involved in one of these terrorist investigations, one of the key elements of the investigation here is a vehicle. We've seen it over and over again, and again, that's what got investigators going here. There was a guy who got in a scuffle with two men whom he simply described as being of Arabic background. He got on the plane, didn't think anything more of it. He got to his destination, and like all of us yesterday, he looked up at the television monitor and said, "Oh my God," and he heard that these planes came from Boston. He called authorities here and said, "Look, I got into it with these guys. This is the car. This is where it parked." They went there. That's where they found these flight manuals in Arabic. They traced that car to these two men, and were able to pretty much figure out that they were key players in this terrorist attack.
All right, Chris Hansen at Logan Airport in Boston for us. Let's go back to Pete Williams now, our Justice Department correspondent. Pete?
Well, Tom, a couple of things. First of all, just to follow up on what Chris Hansen said, federal law enforcement officials say the discovery of that car, the follow-up on evidence that was in it, they say, quote, looks very promising. So obviously, that is the biggest break so far in this case. They also tell us, and this may seem obvious at this point, but it just has to be said, that what is happening at that hotel in Boston is definitely related to the terrorism investigation. So it's certainly that we're watching. Now, in terms of why they're there, officials caution us that they're going to be doing this a lot in the coming days, serving what are called material witness warrants, which are used when you have reason to want to hold someone for questioning. You don't want them to flee. You have reason to believe that they have information that would be useful to investigators, but you don't have evidence that they were involved in the crime. That, they tell us, is what we're going to be seeing a lot of in the next few days, as indeed we saw right before the millennium last time when there were reports of terrorism plots all over the U.S., these material witnesses warrants being served by the dozens around the U.S., and I'm sure we'll be seeing that in the next few days, Tom.
All right, Pete Williams, we'll let you go back to working the phones at the Justice Department and your law enforcement contacts as this investigation goes on. There have been some, I think, fair to say that there have been some ugly incidents developing around this country directed at Arab Americans. Mosques have been defaced. We're told that online chat rooms now have condemned all Arabs. We have to remind everyone that there are more than 7 million Arab Americans in this country of Islamic faith, and they are not terrorists. These are people of strong faith who are law-abiding American citizens. And in fact, in the Middle East and many of those Arab nations that we have been talking about, there are moderate leaders, including King Abdullah today of Jordan, who condemned this attack and condemned those small celebrations that took place on the West Bank yesterday. I'm joined now by former Secretary of State James Baker. Mr. Baker, we are talking about the place of moderate Arabs in American life, not just those who live here, but those in the Middle East as well. You're very familiar with that part of the world. That's going to be a tricky piece for America in the coming days.
Yes, it is, Tom. I think it's always important to remember when we talk about Islamic fundamentalism that there are an awful lot of fundamentalist Muslims who are very, very good friends of the United States, many of them American citizens, but also citizens of other friendly countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the Gulf countries and other countries. So when we condemn fundamentalists, we really should make it clear we're talking only about radical Islamic fundamentalists.
You have served in the White House as Secretary of State and as Treasury Secretary during times of great crises. When as it now appears, this death toll begins to go very, very high, no question there will be a real sense of rage in this country. That, too, will require some very skillful political leadership across party lines in Washington and across America.
I think that all Americans are really going to unite behind the president. We've already seen that. There's not going to be any political partisanship at a time like this, and I really believe that there's going to be great sentiment on the part of the large majority of the American people to hit back and to do so as effectively as possible. And in that regard, Tom, I might say that when the first President Bush decided he was going to eject Iraq from Kuwait, we were successful in bringing the international community together behind that effort. We had Arab states, indeed, that were members of the international coalition. Most Arab states today, even some that in the past have sponsored state terrorism, have condemned this action and expressed a sense of condolence. And I really hope and believe that we will give some thought to building an international coalition to deal with this problem, because this was more than an assault on America. This was an assault on freedom-loving peoples everywhere, and it is something that I think we might be successful in building a coalition to defeat, first through economic and political sanctions, then perhaps through military means once we've pinpointed responsibility.
What is the instrument for doing that? Does the United States lead that with its NATO partners and other partners as they pick them up?
No, I think that the instrument for doing that, as it was in the Gulf War, would be the United States' superior military technology and ability. It's not going to be easy. You don't want to just blow holes in the desert. That's been one of the frustrations in the past dealing with terrorists. When U.S. citizens were taken hostage in Lebanon and we were in office, we never had many good choices, because yes, we could hit them with missiles or air strikes and that sort of thing. But by the time you do that, the terrorist action's taken place, the terrorists have fled, and you're just blowing holes in the desert. That's not a very good idea. I was very pleased to hear last night when President Bush said, we're not only going to hold responsible the people who actually did this and organized it, we're going to hold responsible those countries and peoples who harbor those people. And to my way of thinking, it wouldn't be a bad idea if indeed it turns out that Osama bin Laden was behind this, it wouldn't be a bad idea, in my view, to pick up the phone and call Kabul and say, okay, we want him in 48 hours, or we want him in a week, or whatever time period you put on it. That was successful. We set a deadline in the Gulf War. It worked. I would think we might want to give some consideration to doing the same thing today.
All right. Thank you very much, former Secretary of State James Baker, who has been a wise counsel to a number of presidents with a very thoughtful and at the same time provocative suggestion that we simply pick up the phone, call Kabul and say we want Osama bin Laden if he is identified as the ringleader and mastermind behind all this in 48 hours, or else, because as the president warned, any country that harbored these terrorists would suffer punishment as well. One of our staffers at CNBC in Singapore dialed the foreign ministry in Kabul not so long ago, just today, and was told by a spokesperson there, yes, Osama bin Laden is in Afghanistan. That spokesperson saying, I have seen him. When and where, we cannot say, of course. NBC's Rahema Ellis is in lower Manhattan, as she was all day yesterday, and at Ground Zero last night. Rahema, the news does not get much better from there.
No, Tom, indeed it does not, but the hope continues here. I'm in an area right now, and from this point down, the effort here is focused on recovery and saving lives. Ironically, some of the rescuers have been in need of being rescued themselves. Hundreds of them, we are told, firefighters fear that hundreds of their own may be trapped inside the tangled debris because those firefighters were in the area when some parts of the World Trade Center came crashing down. And in the midst of what seems like and looks like an impossible task, there have been reasons to hope. 2 Port Authority workers were pulled from the rubble last night alive, and early this morning, 5 firefighters were pulled from the debris and 1 was conscious. We don't know the conditions of those men at this hour. Hundreds of firefighters are literally working around the clock. I've been here all night long and watched them as they came through the area. Listen to what one firefighter from Staten Island told me about why he is here.
Thank you.
Did you want to come?
Oh, of course, everybody does. Just to help. Civilians in there, volunteers, a lot of people helping. Everybody's doing their part. We're going to need everybody because it's going to take a long time.
They are literally working around the clock. And I said to some of these rescue workers, how is it that you keep going? They said they are fatigued, but they are running on adrenaline. I also asked them, how can you prepare for something like this? One firefighter said to me, there's no way to prepare for it. You just come to this area and do the best that you can. Again, literally hundreds of firefighters from as far away as Rhode Island and across to Pennsylvania and everywhere in between have come here with a commitment to see this task through to the end. Although, as many of them have said to me, they have no idea, Tom, as to when they'll be going home.
All right, Rahima Ellis in Lower Manhattan, where the search and rescue effort continues, people volunteering. They're having a hard time getting a lot of those firemen and emergency rescue workers, in fact, to go off shift to get some rest and to get some food and to come back at another time. This will be going on not just for the next 24 hours, but for the next several days. We're joined now by General Norman Schwarzkopf, who is the commander of the Allied forces in Operation Desert Storm. We just heard your old colleague, James Baker, the former Secretary of State, say that what we ought to do, if it is in fact Osama bin Laden, is pick up the phone, call Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, say to the Taliban officials, we want him in 48 hours or else. Think that's a good idea?
Not a bad idea if we know he's there. That's a secret. We've got to know he's there before we can do something like that. What I thought was very important, what Jim Baker said, though, was about our other friends in the area. I've got to tell you that I knew Prince Abdullah very, very well, and I consider him a very good friend of our country. I worked with the Pakistanis a great deal during the time of the Afghan resistance against the Soviet Union. And I will tell you, I have some very, very dear friends in the United Arab Emirates, beginning with Sheikh Zayed and his son, Prince Mohammed, who are truly good friends of ours. So we have to be very careful that we just don't condemn every Arab or condemn everyone who practices Islam. That's really an important thing.
General Schwarzkopf, I think a lot of Americans are puzzled why they don't hear more support from the United States from, for example, Kuwait, which was liberated by the United States, or from our friends in Saudi Arabia, which had its fanny saved by the United States during Operation Desert Storm, or from some of the other moderate Arab states that in fact have relied on American military aid and economic aid, for that matter, principally including Egypt.
Well, many of those countries are on very shaky legs. They are walking that tightrope between supporting Islam, supporting their religion, which of course they will always do. Got to remember, the king of Saudi Arabia calls himself the keeper of the 2 holy mosques of Mecca and Medina. He doesn't call himself the king. And also the fact that many of these countries have indirectly financed all of the operations against Israel. Even when they are violently pro-American, they are also violently anti-Israel. And they have to be very careful and walk this tight line because there are elements, such as Osama bin Laden, who has announced that all of these regimes were corrupt and he wants to overthrow all of them. It's not a cut and dried black and white world over there. It's very, very murky.
We don't want to get into the blame game during this time of a national crisis, but were you surprised when the new Bush administration didn't get more directly involved in what was going on in the Middle East as the escalation of violence played out on television screens here and in the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and the other West Bank villages in that part of the world?
Yeah, I'm really not qualified to answer that, Tom, because I can't give you exactly how much they were involved and how much they weren't involved. There's no question about the fact that the United States is going to have to play a major role if we're ever going to see peace in the Middle East between the Arabs and the Israelis. On the other hand, there's no cut and dried, simple answer. As you know, it's a very, very, very tedious business that at any time, you know, the plate can fall off the table.
All right, thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who's been with us during the past 24 hours and will be with us throughout the rest of this day as well. Baseball, Major League Baseball has postponed for the third straight day. That's the first time that 2 complete days in a row have been postponed in the Major League Baseball schedule since World War I in 1918. This obviously will have an effect on the season as well, but this country is on hold, understandably, until we can figure out how many people can be saved in Lower Manhattan, how many people have been killed there, what the political and military response to all of this will be, and certainly what the situation is at the Pentagon. This is a wounded nation, and it's still in the process of healing. All other business in this country, both retail, commercial business, the business of leisure and entertainment, all have been put on hold as people focus on their own lives and grieve with the families who have loved ones trapped in the rubble that you see before you there. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now, who's keeping track of the aviation situation for us. Robert, there was some talk about lifting the ban on takeoffs at noon today, but that's been delayed some, I gather.
It has, and all the major airlines, well, most of them are now saying that they won't fly until after 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time at the first. So that includes United Airlines, Delta, U.S. Air, Alaska. They won't fly until after 6 p.m. Pacific Time. Continental has said it will fly only minimally today, even tonight. Minimally meaning probably just those flights that were suspended yesterday where passengers were in mid-flight at some connecting point, and they go on and take them to the destination. Northwest has said that it won't fly at all today. Southwest has said that it won't fly at all today either. My hunch is that some of these airlines that have said they'd try after 6 p.m., that in the end they won't fly even this evening. TWA says it's grounded indefinitely. Midway, which already was in financial trouble, flying under Chapter 11, essentially went out of business today. They said they're going to close down more or less permanently because they fear that passengers will be afraid to fly from now on and that all the airlines will take an economic hit. We can tell you something about restrictions at the airport, some of this new security that people have been talking about. Planes carrying mail, so they're the principal carrier of mail in this country. They're not going to be allowed to take mail in passenger planes for at least another 48 hours is what we understand now. So the post office is going to have to weigh in with more mail trucks for the time being. There will be increased screening, as we've heard, of passengers and carry-on luggage in particular. There'll be no curbside baggage. Sale of knife-like objects is now being banned at airports, and I think one version I heard of this is even plastic knives at airport concessions are being banned. And if you can believe it, knives were not part of the absolutely don't allow through screening list before. Well, now they are. No knives or knife-like objects are going to be permitted through screening. That means that passengers will not be able to carry them on airliners from now on. Tom?
Watch NBC's Robert Hager. That has always been, I thought, an uneven part of airport security, Bob. I have in one of my kit bags a Swiss Army knife, as a lot of people do. Sometimes it goes through, sometimes it does not. When I'm in Europe or traveling in the Middle East, it always gets picked up and it's handed off to one of the flight attendants, and I get it back at the end of the flight. But in this country, it just really does depend on the airport. But as you say, there will be a big crackdown on all of that.
Tom, if you're with me.
Yes, go ahead.
I had a thought about on the investigative side on the cockpit voice recorders, because we said previously that should provide important clues as to what went on in the cockpit. But there are two possibilities there. One being that if these people were sophisticated enough to fly the plane, if they didn't want to leave a footprint of who they were, that's a fairly easy off switch there, to hit the cockpit recorder button and turn it off. People have done that before. It came up with Silk Air in Indonesia, where the pilot, we believe, committed suicide, and he made sure to cut off the cockpit voice recorder before he did it. One other thing, I'm not sure if they find a cockpit voice recorder that we'll hear about it immediately. When the NTSB finds one in a normal case, they tell us about it right away. But this is all under the jurisdiction of FBI and criminal agencies at this point, and if they find the cockpit voice recorder, that would be a valuable find and a valuable potential piece of evidence if it wasn't turned off, and I'm not sure they'd tell us right away.
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Robert Hager. The search for the cockpit voice recorder and the rubble of the Twin Trade Towers at the World Trade Center here in New York is going to be a critical part of that search and rescue effort. They're trying to find people who may be alive, first of all, trying to recover the dead. But Robert Bazell and others who have been down there say it's just stunning to see how small the pieces of debris are when you realize that these were two 110-story buildings that completely collapsed in what amounted to a junk pile of concrete, steel, glass, and electrical circuitry. Let's go to NBC George Lewis now, who is in Los Angeles at Los Angeles International Airport. That was the destination of 3 of the 4 flights that were hijacked yesterday. It's a ghost town today. George?
Yeah, Tom, it is a ghost town. There's nothing taking off or landing here. There are maintenance trucks going up and down. It looks like some of the aircraft here, some of the 178 aircraft that are on the ground here are being maintained perhaps in preparation for eventually resuming normal operations. But the people here at LAX tell us that they don't know when things will get back to normal. As Bob Hager reported, there are going to be all sorts of new security restrictions. The people here at LAX confirm that it may be a situation where people are not permitted to check bags at the curbside. There may be new parking restrictions. You may see canine units, dogs sniffing luggage throughout the airport, all sorts of police presence that wasn't there before. So, as you said, all of the flights, all of the hijacked flights were headed for California. So all of the horrendous events back east have enormous implications here. Shocked and grieving, the relatives of the airline passengers were quickly escorted to a private area at LA International and later to 2 nearby hotels. Among the passengers bound for Los Angeles, David Angel, the producer of the TV series Frasier, and lawyer and TV commentator Barbara Olson, wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. Before her plane crashed into the Pentagon, Olson reportedly called her husband twice on a mobile phone to tell him the jetliner was being hijacked by men with knives, that the crew and all the passengers were being forced to the back of the aircraft. On United Airlines 93, the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, Tom Burnett, vice president of a medical devices company in Northern California, called his wife and indicated he and other passengers were trying to overcome the hijackers. Father Frank Colachico, a friend of the family.
Yeah, he called her on the cell phone and told her that one of the passengers was already dead and that they knew that they were all going to die and that 2 other men and he were going to try to do something, the conversation, and love you, honey. And that was the end of the conversation.
On the same plane, Mark Bingham called his mother and his aunt.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that?
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
I hope it was quick. I hope he took an active part in thwarting the hijackers.
Last night in Los Angeles, friends of 2 other hijacking victims attended a special church service, turning to their faith to ease the pain of the loss. Family members who are related to the people who were on the 3 LA-bound planes have been taken to 2 hotels near the airport, one operated by American Airlines, the other for the United Airlines people. They're meeting with airline personnel and grief counselors at this hour, hoping to hear any details of their loved ones. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC George Lewis at Los Angeles International Airport. That intriguing report that there was a cell phone call made from one of the passengers on board the plane that they were going to try to take action against the hijackers. That may have caused that plane to crash outside of Pittsburgh. It was turned around and headed for the eastern seaboard. We can only presume that it was headed back toward Washington, D.C. The plane that had taken off from Dulles crashed into the Pentagon, you'll recall. The flight, this one was from Newark to San Francisco, got out over Pennsylvania before it made a very sharp U-turn in the sky, but then it went down before it could reach the nation's capital. Grief counselors have been working with the families of the people who were on board those 4 airliners. Obviously, yesterday, grief counselors are at work. Therapists are being called to hospitals here in Manhattan. And then thousands of people who were in the vicinity yesterday are having to deal with their grief on their own. One of them is Clifton Cloud, who was in the immediate vicinity of the World Trade Center when the airplane struck and when the Twin Towers came down, and he joins us now. Mr. Cloud, why don't you briefly recap for us where you were and what you saw?
I was on the roof of a parking garage right in my neighborhood on Essex Street, and I saw the gaping hole in the first tower, and I ran home to get my video camera because I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And when I was videotaping the building, all of a sudden I saw this massive explosion and this white flash of light, which the camera didn't pick up. Seconds later, I felt the blast and just instantly realized how many people were involved and the human face on the tragedy of that building going down. It was much more than I expected to see yesterday.
Did you have friends who worked in either of those buildings?
Yes, the company I work for, ACE, we have a lot of clients. Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter. You know, I've been in that building. I've climbed in the ceilings. We have crews in there all the time. As a matter of fact, I called our company right away because I knew we probably had people on their way to that building or in the building to get them on the radio to tell them to get out, because this was obviously more than just an accident of an airplane that everyone thought at first. And I tried to call them, I called my wife, and it was shocking. It was a real tragedy. And when you're in that building and you know how high the floors are and you see helicopters flying around and you realize that those flames were 10 and 20 stories high and deep into the building, you know that, that there was tremendous loss of life and a lot of wonderful, good people.
Mr. Cloud, as you and I continue to talk, I'm going to ask our control room to find that remarkable piece of New York City Fire Department videotape and run it in slow motion. That was the first airplane that went into the World Trade Center Tower number 1. And as they get that prepared, let me just ask you about what kind of a night you had last night.
Last night, my wife and my son, we brought his crib into our bedroom. We honestly didn't know what to expect. You know, when you live in New York, especially in the last 6 years or so, you see people committed. I saw firemen running with their gear to try to get downtown, and I felt like we were in good hands, but there was no telling what would happen. So my son and my wife and I, we all slept in the same room. We brought his crib in, and this morning when I woke up, I was glad that everything was still okay. And I personally thank, you know, all of the people that are down there, you know, that are working for all of us, you know, for all of our benefits.
Maybe you can share with the rest of the country the spirit of New York. It's got a tough guy reputation, but a pretty tender heart, doesn't it?
You know, New York, if you live in New York, you know, there's struggles, daily struggles, but everyone that lives here loves the city. I just flew back from Arkansas, and whenever I fly, I always get a window seat, because if there's a chance of me seeing the skyline, I want to see it every time. And there was actually a gentleman in the aisle seat next to me who kind of said, "Excuse me, could I see the view also?" And he was another New Yorker. No matter how long you live here, you love that skyline. You love the icon of the World Trade Center, but also you deeply know inside that icon represents people. It represents some of the hardest working people who've climbed up, that have taken their hits. They've worked hard to get here. They commute. They work, whether they're cleaning the building or making incredible large decisions, you know, involving many people. They work hard at what they do, and they care deeply about what they do. And you know, New York City has been home from everyone from George Washington to Al Sharpton, and I think that, you know, our diversity is what makes us strong, and nobody is going to knock us out. And I thought also, when I saw the pictures of the people jumping out of the building, you know, maybe 20 terrorists died, maybe 20 terrorists committed suicide into the buildings, but a lot more New Yorkers jumped rather than be burned alive, because, you know, New Yorkers are always, and as Americans, I believe, are always doing what they can.
Mr. Cloud, thank you very much for being with us, and give your child a hug for us as well, and we hope that your life gets back to normal before too long.
Thank you very much.
Clifton Cloud, who was in the vicinity of the World Trade Center yesterday with his home video camera when all of that carnage occurred, and it is a great tribute to the city that it does pull together so often during times like this. It is a city that represents the entire world, every ethnicity, every faith, every region in this country, every small town in this country is represented in some small way in New York City. But in a time of a crisis, it is just one city working in one direction. And the New York City public officials, who are always on the griddle here, held to the fire by the tabloids and by the various constituencies, they too have been doing heroic work at the state and at the city level. I think that it's worth saying. We want to tell you as well that this is the latest situation as we have it. The President said today, we are at war. That's the word he used, with terrorists. The FBI in Boston have identified a terrorist cell. We think there may have been an arrest there. The FBI is requesting warrants for what they call material witnesses. Pete Williams, our Justice Department correspondent, says they're fanning out across the country, and they're arresting people who refuse to cooperate or answer questions from them. 8 people were pulled alive from the World Trade Center last night, and at the Pentagon now they have revised downward, gratefully, the death toll. They were saying yesterday it could be as high as 800. Now just over 100 people were killed. It's still an unacceptable toll. Now let's look at this remarkable piece of tape, and I'd like to just rerun that in slow motion if we can. That was a New York City Fire Department training mission in Lower Manhattan yesterday, armed with a video camera, when American Airlines Flight 111 flew in. Here is the second airplane that flew into Twin Trade Towers number 2. But now we're going to show you in slow-mo, as you'll see a fireman on the street, a very low-flying plane that many people in Lower Manhattan saw. It was flying at an altitude that one experienced pilot said could not have been more than about 1,000 feet. They look up casually. The camera catches the plane, and there it goes into Tower number 1 at the World Trade Center. A stunning development. When we all heard what had happened, everyone assumed, at the beginning at least, I would guess everyone, that it was some kind of a terrible accident. It wasn't until the second plane went into the second tower then that the cold reality that this was a terrorist attack began to dawn on New York City. And
this is a News 4 special report, Attack on America.
Good afternoon, everyone. A local update now. A full-scale rescue operation remains impossible to begin at the Pentagon. The fire that erupted when American Flight 77 slammed into the west face of the building is not out yet 24 hours later. But work continues at the Pentagon, the work of extinguishing the fire, recovering any survivors, locating the flight's black box, and the business of the nation's defense. Sarah Lee is at the Pentagon now. She joins us with the latest. Sarah Lee?
Good afternoon, Susan. The smoke has dissipated somewhat out here at the Pentagon. As you said, more than a day later, still smoldering out here at the Pentagon. However, with the smoke dissipated, it does make it a little bit easier for the rescuers to do their job. As you can see, they're still out there, right there at the impact zone. However, they're having difficulty to actually get in there and try to make any kind of rescue or recovery because the area of the impact zone is still very unstable. However, in the rest of the Pentagon today, it is back to work for the people who work here. But earlier, just about 2 hours ago, they had a big scare. Shortly before noon today, the building was evacuated. Even the rescuers had to stop what they were doing and get away from the building. What we had heard were loudspeakers that said something like unidentified incoming aircraft, something to that effect, announcing that to people that they should get away from the building. They were not sure what this aircraft was, but then it was cleared up later that this was actually a friendly aircraft, nothing for people to be alarmed about. Shortly after that, people did go back into the building. Out here, we have seen FBI agents patrolling the grounds, looking for clues, picking up anything out among the debris that they think may be useful in their investigation. Another important agency that's out here at work is the American Red Cross. Earlier, we spoke with someone with the American Red Cross. This is what he told us about their efforts out here today.
Providing food and drink, a place for them to rest. The Red Cross also has professional mental health workers who have shut down their practice for the day or for as long as we need them, and are here providing grief and crisis counseling for the rescue workers and for victims of this disaster at all 3 sites.
And here out at the Pentagon, they have a tent set up. The American Red Cross has their tent set up on the south parking lot here at the Pentagon, offering rescuers some kind of relief, as he said, some food, a place to rest, and also, as he had mentioned, those mental health experts, because this is really just an extremely traumatic experience for not only the people who work at the Pentagon, but of course those rescuers that are in there this afternoon, trying now into their 2nd day to help try to recover or rescue anyone that may be in there. At this point, there is no count on how many victims may be in there. However, officials have confirmed for us that there are people in there who did not survive this. However, some sources do tell us that at some parts of the building that may be a little bit more stabilized, they say it may be viable that there might be survivors. Again, that comes from sources. As for families who are still unsure what's happened to their loved ones, they can go to the Sheraton in Crystal City to try to get any more information there. That's the latest out here at the Pentagon. Susan, back to you.
All right, thank you, Sarah. National Airport and Dulles Airport remain closed at this hour. We're going to show you a live picture of National. No one's being allowed inside except essential employees, and the same is true for Dulles. Those airports are expected to reopen to the public at 3 o'clock, but only so people can return to pick up their luggage and cars. Only the baggage claim and parking areas will be open. Officials say National Airport, the National Airport Metro Station, will also open at 3 o'clock. BWI is closed as well. No word on when it might reopen. The FAA had said it would lift the flight ban across the country at noon today. That ban has now been extended. No word on when flights will be allowed to resume. We still know very little about the numbers and identities of those killed in yesterday's attack. We do know there were local victims aboard American Flight 77. Michelle Heidenberger was a flight attendant from Chevy Chase. She was 57 and had worked for American for at least 25 years. Her sister-in-law has reportedly said the Dulles-Los Angeles route was a new one for her, and she was trying to switch back to another route she'd worked more often. Heidenberger lived with her husband, a pilot for U.S. Air, and their 11-year-old son and college-age daughter. A family from University Park also believed to be among the victims. Leslie Whittington, Charles Falkenberg, and their daughters, Zoe and Dana, were on their way to Australia. A phone message at Whittington's Georgetown office said she and her family would be in Australia until late November. It ended, "We'll see you when we get back." 3 D.C. school children and 3 teachers, all from different schools, on an educational field trip were on board, as was Barbara Olson, the wife of the Solicitor General Theodore Olson. There were 64 people aboard Flight 77, all presumed dead. Still no death count from the Pentagon. We now rejoin Network News. I'll be back with a local news update at the top of the hour.
Those in authority should take appropriate precautions to protect our citizens.
Across the nation, it is clear things are far from normal. This morning, air travel still shut down, stock markets closed, sporting events postponed, Broadway shows dark, and U.S. military forces worldwide on high alert. Warships patrolling the waters off Washington and New York, AWACS radar planes patrolling the skies. As rescuers toil, another high-stakes effort is underway to find those responsible for the carnage. NBC's Chris Hansen reports investigators are making swift progress.
Authorities may have identified some of the actual hijackers, and here's how they think they might have done that. Yesterday, they got a phone call from a passenger who had left Logan and arrived at his destination. Of course, he saw on the television monitors what had happened at the World Trade Center. He called investigators to say that he had had an altercation with 2 men he described as being Arabic in the central parking garage near the American Airlines terminal here at Boston Logan. He described the car that they were near, which was turned out to be a rental car, a Mitsubishi sedan. Investigators arrived at the sedan, took a quick look, and they found inside that there were flight training manuals in Arabic. They were able to connect that sedan to 2 men who are now identified as brothers, both of whom have passports from the United Arab Emirates, one of whom is a trained pilot. 2 to 3 other suspects may have come across the border into the U.S. from Canada and flown here yesterday morning from Portland, Maine to take part in the hijackings.
And today in Florida, FBI agents spend hours questioning instructors at a flight school and confiscating potential evidence. Their focus, 2 men described as Middle Eastern who trained at the school last year. By midday, reports that the FBI has connected the two with yesterday's terrorist acts.
All right, that's Stone Phillips bringing us up to date on everything that has happened since the attacks yesterday beginning this morning. Let's go to Florida now, and NBC's Kerry Sanders, who knows some more about those 2 suspects who were trained as pilots in Florida in the fall of last year. Kerry?
Well, on the flight manifest, one of the names that shows up is Mohammed Atta, and that is one of the people who trained at that Venice Flying School on Florida's west coast. I'm here on the east coast in Coral Springs, which isn't too far from Fort Lauderdale, and behind me is an apartment complex where Mohammed Atta lived for a short period of time. The FBI came out here last night. They searched the apartment. There were some more FBI agents who came out again today. They have since left. Now, when Mohammed Atta left this part of Florida and moved over to the west coast in Venice, Florida, on the Gulf Coast, he actually had a roommate whose name was Marwan al-Shahi, and they housed for about a week at a home of a resident over there, and they told the residents there that they were German, that they were not Arabs, that they were in the area learning to fly planes. And I've spoken to the flight certification. Let me get the actual name. It's called a designated pilot examiner. That's a person who the FAA designates to take these people up after they spent time flying to see if indeed they qualify for a commercial rating. He says that he took them up about 3 times each individually, and as they were flying, they went ahead and met all of the certifications, and at that point he went ahead and rubber stamped them, and on they went. He says nothing really stood out about them. It's not unusual in Florida to get people from foreign countries learning to fly to get their commercial ratings, because the weather is so good down here and you have flat land, and it appeals to a lot of people to come to this country to learn to fly. They were learning to fly at the Venice Flying School, and I spoke to one of the representatives there at the flying school who went through some of the records that they had. Most of the records were picked up early this morning. The FBI picked up about 8 to 10 boxes of records and have since taken them away. But a few remaining records that they looked through, including date of birth. But the one thing that this administrator there at the school says that she remembers was that these 2 guys sort of hung out together. They didn't really mingle with the other students. And I asked her, did they have a problem paying for these classes? Because, as you may guess, it's not inexpensive to learn to fly, especially to get a commercial rating. She said it was about $25,000 per person to get this rating, to learn to fly a commercial plane. And she said they had no problem paying. They wrote with checks. The checks always cleared. They were always on time with their pay. Getting back to the designated pilot examiner, the one question I wondered was, after they finished learning to fly and actually got their rating, could they then just get into the cockpit of a 757 or a 767? Because all they got their rating on was a twin-engine piston plane, a Seneca. He says you could not get into a 757 and a 767 after getting this rating, take off and land. But you could get into a Boeing 757 or 767, have this training, sit down, and fly the plane in the air for a short period of time. So he says, you know, that it would be no problem for these people to have gotten into the seats of the cockpit there and to have flown the plane with the training that they had. Now, at this point, the one thing that we were able to trace is that Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shahi both had this very temporary Florida address, and they have Florida driver's licenses, but they also had addresses in Germany. And we had some producers go by that location in Germany, in Hamburg, and as they arrived, the German police were just arriving, and the German police were taking out boxes of evidence there. So at this point, the authorities are focusing considerably on Florida, here on the East Coast in Coral Springs, as well as the flying school, and they're trying to connect the dots. The last thing I have, which just sort of shows that they have been in the country for some time, was that they enrolled last July into the Venice Flying School, and they really completed their training there in January, even though they had actually gotten their commercial ratings in November and December. They wrapped up in January. So at this point, the FBI is going to be possibly saying something out of Miami a little bit later today, Tom, but there's no confirmation on that yet.
And do we have any idea on how they were in this country? Were they on a tourist visa? Have they applied for a green card? Have they just slipped in here undocumented in some fashion and then hid out?
All very good questions, questions that the FBI is rapidly going through paperwork and trying to resolve, but at this point there's no answer to that.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Kerry Sanders. A nifty piece of detective work down there in Florida. Two of these men were trained as pilots in Florida last fall, and the man who examined their capabilities said that they would be able to, once a Boeing 757 got into the air, take the controls and steer it. And it appears to greatly tragic effect. That's exactly what they did. So that is the latest report that we have from Kerry Sanders. We'll keep you up to date on his investigation in Florida, and an investigation that is going on in Florida, in Boston, and around the world. We also heard that German police are now involved. Let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell and see if she has anything additional to add in terms of this investigation. Andrea?
Well, what's so interesting about what Kerry is just reporting is that these men were there last year, last July. This, as the CIA and other intelligence officials have suspected, was not a quick plan. This is something that has been formulated for many months, if not a year. And it's not something precipitated by the most recent violence involving the Israelis and the Palestinians in the Intifada. This is something that is deep-rooted animus against the United States. And there are a certain number of groups, fairly few, who have these feelings and who have the capability of pulling this kind of thing off. That's why Colin Powell and others have been suggesting in our interviews for the last 24 hours that it had to be someone very sophisticated, very well organized, and with a lot of money. That is another reason why they've been looking at bin Laden. You heard that there is a pretty good trail being developed out of Logan Airport, and the two men who stayed in Maine apparently and then switched to a flight from Maine to the doomed flight, the flight that was hijacked, or one or both of the flights that were hijacked out of Boston. And we heard from John Ashcraft, the Attorney General, last night when he was briefing members of Congress, that 3 to 5 hijackers were on each plane. So gradually, actually fairly rapidly, I think, the FBI is putting together a pretty good picture of what might have taken place and of how they were making these connections. The involvement of the German police just tells you how global this concern is. Colin Powell told me this morning that he's been on the phone with leaders around the world. We know that the Pakistanis have sent a military delegation to Afghanistan and that they are being tasked. Our intelligence colleagues in Pakistan are being told that they've got to prove that they've got some influence over Afghanistan to try to ferret out better information about where the U.S. can find Osama bin Laden. Tom?
Andrea Mitchell, can you tell us about any diplomatic initiative plans that are under consideration at the State Department?
You bet. There's a possibility that Colin Powell would be traveling, but initially what he is doing is talking to leaders around the world. And we are getting very interesting help from a couple of unlikely places, Russia and China. Perhaps not so unlikely by people like you, Tom, who know the nuances of foreign policy, because Russia obviously has a long-standing, many decades grievance against Afghanistan and would like nothing better than to take some steps with intelligence through shared borders and the like that would help the U.S. in some sort of retaliatory mode if that is the direction they're going. China, because of their concern about some of these terror groups and unrest in that very complicated country, and their concern about keeping control and security control over their citizenry. So there are a number of nations. I was just talking to the Prime Minister of Australia the other day, who was talking about their concern about people coming through Manila who might be influenced by bin Laden or under bin Laden's control, trying to create terror seeds in Australia, some 1,500 miles away from the most previously known outposts of bin Laden's empire in the Philippines and in Indonesia. So there is quite a global reach, and that is the kind of thing that Powell and others and other agencies are trying to accomplish.
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now, who's keeping track of aviation developments. There had been some thought that planes would be allowed to take off at around noon Eastern time today. Obviously, we have passed that deadline. Most of the majors are saying it will be 6 or later before they begin to fly. Midway, which was a highly valued airline in the Midwest, until the economic times took a tumble, it has gone out of business today, Bob tells us. Bob, what is the latest on scheduled flights from the major carriers?
Well, as you say, the last time we talked, they were all over the lot. Some carriers were going to try to get back in the air after 6 o'clock tonight. Others just weren't going to try it. Now the FAA has laid down the rules, so we know the operation at this point. They're essentially grounding all U.S. air traffic, throwing in the towel for a second day now, with one important exception. Flights that were diverted yesterday can continue on to their original destinations today, but they'll only be allowed to take passengers that were on that original flight that had been diverted and then have to be carried to their original destination. There's one other exception. Airlines can move empty aircraft to get them into position to resume operations tomorrow, so that's an important break for airlines. Give you an example on that interrupted flight or diverted flight exception that the FAA is allowing. So let's say a plane was flying from Denver scheduled to Washington or New York, and those airports were both closed after the initial hits at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So that flight to Denver would not have been allowed into, from Denver, wouldn't have been allowed into Washington or New York, its intended destination. Let's say it diverted to Columbus, Ohio. Well, under these rules, the passengers that were on that flight and now need to get from Columbus to their original destinations could at this point. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, Robert Hager. We're going to go to one of the busiest airports in the nation, and that is, of course, Chicago's O'Hare Field. Like all the airports in America today, it's not busy at all, and NBC's Kevin Tibbles is there. Kevin?
Well, Tom, yes, indeed, it's a very busy airport. 1 million flights leave from this airport each year. 250,000 people go through this airport every day. As you just mentioned, no one is coming to and from this airport so far today. As Bob Hager just reported, we're also hearing that airlines like United are taking reservations for 6 p.m. We've only had one plane take off here so far today, and United tells us it was a plane with a crisis crew headed for Pittsburgh to help with the grieving families there. We're seeing some truck movement, some planes are being moved around, but so far only that one plane has taken off. When the airport does reopen for business, we're also told that the word convenience is going to be removed from the lexicon of air aviation travel in this country. There's going to be no more curbside check-in and the like. Security is going to be real tough. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Kevin Tibbles. Any of you who have been flying on commercial airliners in this country in the last year know that even with curbside check-in, that the traffic jams and the people jams have been horrendous. They're only going to get worse, ladies and gentlemen, and if you're going to fly, you better count on arriving at the airport not a half an hour before your scheduled liftoff, but at least an hour, or better yet, an hour and a half. If you're in Europe and you're flying, especially to international destinations, you have to be there very often 2 hours in advance. It is going to change the course of American life. That's an armed Humvee in lower Manhattan, the National Guard manning it as the search and rescue efforts continue and the removal of the debris from the collapse of the World Trade Center yesterday. We want to go to CNBC's Ron Insana. Of course, that very area is the financial nerve center of the world. The markets have been closed for 2 days. When they opened in Japan, that Nikkei index immediately took a hammering. People are beginning to talk very quietly at the highest levels about the possibility of a very severe recession as a result of all of this. Ron Insana, what about business leaders and economists that you're talking to today?
Well, Tom, they are still divided as to what the ultimate consequences of this violent event will be with respect to the U.S. economy. There are some who say that this event will create enough uncertainty in the economy of New York, which is not inconsequential, in travel and tourism, air travel in particular, and may cause consumers just out of fear to retrench to such an extent that they will stop spending and tip maybe not just the U.S. economy but the global economy into recession. On the other hand, there are those who are suggesting that the Federal Reserve, by injecting a substantial amount of money into the economy today, some $38 billion, other central banks around the world doing the same, and promises from President Bush to spend as much as it takes to ameliorate the effects of this event, that we might be on a wartime footing and that the economy will grow. These are open questions, can't be resolved in a 24-hour period. One thing I can tell you, Tom, that has just come across the wires and is something of a surprise to me when it comes to the functioning of the markets here in the United States. Germany's stock market is saying that trade in the United States, in the equity markets, the stock market, will remain closed on Thursday. At 3 p.m. Eastern Time,
Richard Grasso, the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, Hardwick Simmons, who heads the NASDAQ, and Harvey Pitt, the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, are planning to hold a news conference at Bear Stearns in New York to discuss this very issue. We had thought, given some comments from the head of the SEC earlier today, that there would be trading tomorrow, but the Germany Stock Exchange says no. We'll get more details in just over 35 minutes' time, Tom.
Ron, in situations like this, very often the great barons of Wall Street get together informally on the telephone or otherwise and say, we cannot let this market tank tomorrow. We've got to send out some very substantial buy orders. Do you think that that's going on?
Well, no doubt those conversations are being had. And if you look at the way Europe responded today, Tom, after yesterday's big sell-off there and the overnight sell-off in Tokyo that you described, European markets are actually on balance higher today rather than lower. They have not recouped their losses, but they have stabilized. And the commodity markets, gold and silver, which rallied sharply yesterday, are not nearly as strong today as they were 24 hours ago. What we will see, if there is that kind of planned and coordinated effect tomorrow to boost the market, or Friday when trading resumes, if that's the day that it happens, there will be plenty of reasons for those brokerage houses to say buy. It is because the Fed's providing liquidity and the government expects to spend their way out of this crisis, Tom.
All right, thanks very much. CNBC's Ron Insana. It goes without saying that the economic hits occur not just on Wall Street, but of course across the country. Think of all the small businesses that lost sales yesterday and again today because the country simply was not in a shopping mood or was otherwise preoccupied. In Manhattan and the outer boroughs of New York City, of course, no business for 24 to 48 hours. A lot of shops were closed today. A lot of people wandering the streets looking for a place to buy a newspaper. Their favorite coffee stands were closed. A lot of the very expensive boutiques on Madison Avenue were closed. Say nothing of the shoe repair shops and the cleaners and the launderers. This is the exhaustion in lower Manhattan. The search and rescue teams of this city, the best in the world, who have been working literally around the clock. They're having a hard time getting some of those firemen and policemen and rescue experts to go home, to go off shift, because between 200 and 300 of their colleagues are missing in the rubble there. And as you look at the faces, this is the portrait of New York. The Irish, the Italian, the Hispanics, the African American, people of almost every ethnic background are represented in that extraordinary workforce that is on duty here because New York is in many ways a sovereign nation unto itself. More than 8 million people altogether, the most vital economy in the world, in this very small patch of concrete and steel and high-rises. Now, 2 of the emblematic buildings in Manhattan are missing, and beneath the rubble are believed to be perhaps as many as 10 or 15,000 people who were at work when those 2 hijacked planes were driven into them. We do expect to hear momentarily from Secretary of State Colin Powell at the State Department in a briefing. He's scheduled to go at 2:30 today at 3 o'clock. The Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States is John Ashcroft, the Attorney General. He is scheduled to have a briefing at 3, and then at 3:30 at the White House, Ari Fleischer, who is President Bush's White House press spokesman, he'll have a briefing on what has been going on there. We did hear from the President after a National Security Council meeting today in which he described this as an act of war. He said we are back in business, the federal government, but it is not business as usual. He encouraged all federal agency heads and others to be keenly aware of the continuing security threat. Although they believe that this attack is over, it did demonstrate to us all just how vulnerable we may be. And as NBC's Robert Hager has been reporting, it is not now clear exactly when major airline travel will get back to normal in America. At first it was noon today and then 6, but some of the other major carriers are pulling back just a bit. Let's hear what Norm Mineta has to say here. He's the Secretary of Transportation. He's announced the FAA will allow a limited reopening of the nation's commercial airspace system in order to allow flights that were diverted yesterday to continue to their original destination. He also announced the FAA is temporarily extending the ground stop imposed yesterday while additional security measures are being completed. He said that safety is always of paramount importance. These extraordinary times, we intend to be very vigilant. At Logan Airport, a lot of people are very defensive, as you might expect, about the security arrangements there. It was at Logan that 2 of the airliners were hijacked by the terrorists and flown into the World Trade Center. And now it does appear that federal law enforcement officials are on the track of at least 2 of them, perhaps 5, as a result of a rental car that they found at the airport. The two suspects had gotten into some kind of an altercation with a traveler at the airport. When he got off his airplane and heard about the hijacking, he called authorities, described for them the car, and they found in the car some what appears to be incriminating evidence. Harry Crosby is a managing director at Merrill Lynch. I think I've got that title correct, Mr. Crosby, who was in the immediate vicinity of the World Trade Center yesterday when the planes hit. Tell us exactly where you were and what you saw.
Yes, Tom. I was going down the West Side Highway by car. I got down as far as Houston Street, which is probably about 15 blocks north. Traffic was slowed to a crawl. The first incident had already occurred. The first impact had hit the northernmost building. I had seen just the plumes of smoke and the flames. Had decided to get out of the car and continue to walk towards my office. Merrill's offices are across the street, and in my mind out of harm's way. I was still far enough away where the impact of the first explosion didn't appear to be as ominous as in fact it was, and proceeded again towards my office, at which time about 6 blocks later the second explosion occurred. I was rather sheltered from that explosion as the plane had come from the south, so I saw the outward explosion but did not see the plane impact the building. At that point, it did appear to me to be not only extraordinarily dangerous, but probably terrorist activity. My first concern was, in fact, still to get to the office rather than turn about face and go in the other direction. And it wasn't, in fact, until I was very close, just about opposite to the World Trade Center, I saw an exodus of many of my colleagues, both at Merrill and many people from Lehman Brothers, a building adjacent, going in the opposite direction.
Mr. Crosby, let me just ask you quickly, you have colleagues in the building that you have not been able to account for?
Our building, Merrill Lynch has no employees in the World Trade Center. We are located in the World Financial Center across the street. And I'm just about to get on a 3 o'clock call to see whether everybody is sound, and as far as I understand, everybody is within our immediate group, and we're going to know more. But our building is off limits for a period of time.
What's your understanding about when the markets may reopen?
We have no news at this point. I think what we're focused on is office space, first head count, and make sure everybody communicates with one another. My guess is the next couple of days the market should open, but I have no real news.
And how severely has your trading operation been damaged? Or you think you can be back at full capacity when you do reopen?
I think we will be able to be full capacity. I will know more. We'll know more at 3 o'clock. I'm on the investment banking side, but we're going to find out a lot of news after that time. I think everybody right now is focused on making sure all of our employees are safe with their families, and focused obviously on finding appropriate space to get back to work. We've talked with all our offices in Europe and Asia.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. We're going to go to the State Department now, and Colin Powell, the
Ladies and
Secretary of State.
gentlemen, I thought what I would do is to update you on the activities of the last several hours since I spoke to the press this morning. Let me begin once again by saying that our hearts go out to all the victims and to their families. It is a tragedy, but as the President has made clear, it is a tragedy that we are strong enough to overcome. Our spirits will not be broken. The resilience of this society will not be broken. We will find out who is responsible for this, and they will pay for it. We are undertaking a full court press diplomatically, politically, militarily, and in the course of the morning and early afternoon, I have been in touch with a number of foreign leaders and international organizational leaders to coordinate the diplomatic approach to this. I have talked to Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations, and I thank the United Nations for the Security Council resolution they passed, and also for the statement from the General Assembly, and I expect the General Assembly to also work on a resolution later today. Lord Robertson in NATO is hard at work with resolution that is under consideration now that would tee up, if I can put it that way, prime Article 5 responsibilities. Article 5 of the Charter says that an attack from abroad by any one against any member of the alliance is an attack against the alliance. If that resolution goes forward, that doesn't invoke Article 5 yet, but it puts in a position to be invoked when the United States makes a judgment about the nature of the attack and where that attack came from. And I appreciate what Lord Robertson and his colleagues are doing for us. I've also been in touch with Foreign Minister of Belgium, Louis Michel, who is also head of the presidency of the EU at this time, and High Representative Javier Solana, to thank them for the strong support we have received from the European Union and the statements they have made and their cooperation promise to us to deal with this tragedy and to move forward. I've also attended, along, of course, with my other colleagues, a National Security Council meeting with the President where we reviewed all that has happened and began to make our plans for the efforts we will be taking in the future, not only to bring these perpetrators to not only justice but to the punishment they deserve, but at the same time to undertake a worldwide effort to build a coalition against all forms of terrorism, wherever it may occur and however it rears its ugly head. This will be a major priority of the administration, and I can assure you it will therefore be a major priority of the State Department. I've also, in the course of the day, spoken to the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, Germany, Canada. I have spoken to Foreign Minister Perez twice, Prime Minister Sharon, Chairman Arafat, and Foreign Minister Manley of Canada, if I didn't mention that, Foreign Minister Ivanov of Russia, Foreign Minister Ruggiero of Italy, and I have another number of other calls that are in the process of being made so that we can bring all of this together. And I must say I am deeply touched by the expressions of support I have received from my colleagues. And as I think you all know, the President has been very busy, and I'm sure the White House has announced his 2 phone calls to President Putin as well as to Mr. Chirac, Jiang Zemin, President Jiang Zemin, Prime Minister Blair, Chancellor Schroeder, and Prime Minister Chrétien. So he's spoken to all 5 members, other 4 members of the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council. And I will leave it to my other cabinet colleagues to talk about the issues under their purview over at Defense, Justice, and FBI. There are, of course, lots of reports and rumors out there, and I think it is wise for all of us to take many of these reports and rumors into some context and perspective. This is also a time, of course, in that regard, for the American people to try, in this time of tragedy, to restore the society to a sense of normalcy. We've got to get back to our jobs. We've got to get back to work. And I know that Secretary Mineta, as soon as it is possible and as soon as it makes sense and is safe, will restore the air traffic system, and commercial air traffic will be brought back online, and I will wait for him to make those announcements with respect to that, and I know that's very much on your mind. Once again, we're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world. It's a scourge not only against the United States, but against civilization, and it must be brought to an end. I will be delighted to take a few questions.
Secretary, the State Department has been advocating restraint in response to terrorism with the argument that violence only provokes more violence. It's an endless cycle. I wondered if the U.S. will be guided by its own admonition now that the U.S. has been horribly attacked by terrorists.
I think when you're attacked by a terrorist and you know who the terrorist is and you can fingerprint back to the cause of the terror, you should respond.
But
Andrew?
I mean, should it be a limited response or?
You should respond, whether it's limited or other than limited. You should respond to those who did it, and if you're able to stop terrorist attacks, you should stop terrorist attacks. Andre?
Secretary Powell, one country you didn't mention was Pakistan, and I understand that your deputy has spoken with the ambassador to Pakistan and that this evening the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan will be meeting with General Musharraf. What specific steps are you asking Pakistan to take, and have you at all insinuated that if all signs do lead to bin Laden, that the U.S. would take military action against Pakistan and Afghanistan?
Our ambassador is going to be seeing going to be having that meeting that you made reference to. It'll probably not be this evening, more likely tomorrow as a result of schedule problems. But Ambassador Armitage, Deputy Secretary Armitage, did meet with Pakistani officials today, and really to share views. We have not made a determination yet as to who is responsible for yesterday's attack, but we thought as we gather information and as we look at possible sources of the attack, it would be useful to point out to the Pakistani leadership at every level that we are looking for and expecting their fullest cooperation and their help and support as we conduct this investigation and as we generate more information, and see if they can be helpful in generating information, as well as how helpful they might be if we find a basis to act upon that information. So yes, we are doing what you described with the Pakistanis. Robin?
Just to clarify, when you say you're building a strong coalition to go after the perpetrators, does this mean that you are expecting or hoping that other countries will participate in some kind of military retaliation?
Under Article 5, if we go that far and it actually is executed, then there is an obligation on the part of our NATO allies to assist if we go in this direction. It doesn't mean that they necessarily will participate in the attack, but it makes it easier to obtain support in the way of overflight rights and things of that nature. So but I don't want to get into what we might or might not do and who might go with us and who might not go with us, because that's just too speculative at the moment.
Can I follow that? Having been through the Gulf War as you were, would you hope to build a kind of coalition that extends perhaps beyond NATO and includes perhaps Muslim nations from different parts of the world?
It should include Muslim nations. Muslim nations have just as much to fear from terrorism that strikes at innocent civilians. And I do have a number of calls, and I just haven't connected yet with other leaders in the world representing Muslim populations. As I was coming down, I was waiting to receive a call from Amr Moussa, head of the Arab League, and I'll also be talking to my Egyptian colleagues and Jordanian colleagues before the evening is out. Yes, sir.
You have not yet mentioned the point that President Bush made last night, the idea of holding other countries responsible.
Yeah.
This seems to be a dramatic escalation in the U.S. view on how it responds to terrorism. Is that a correct interpretation of it? And as a follow-up, you talk about returning to normal, yet there have been all these mentions of acts of war, the idea that the country is in a war. How can we just return to normal when in a situation like this?
Well, on your first point, I mentioned in my earlier statements, and I will mention it again, that it's not just a matter of going after the perpetrators, but it's going after and dealing with the sources of support that they have, whether that source of support might come from a host country or other organizations that provide them. We have to make sure that we go after terrorism and get it by its branch and root. And so we will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups. Now, yes, we believe that acts of war have been committed against the American people, and we will respond accordingly. But at the same time, life has to go on. In all of the difficult times we will be facing ahead, we have to still try to return life to a sense of normalcy. We cannot be a people who are afraid to live. We cannot be a people who will move away from a relatively open society. We cannot be a people who walk around terrified. We're Americans. We don't walk around terrified. We're going to be strong in this difficult period, and we're going to move forward with pride and with determination, and we will get our society back to normal with whatever additional precautions nevertheless might be necessary to secure our society without locking ourselves down. Yes, sir.
Secretary of State Colin Powell briefing reporters at the State Department. The essence of his message, they're trying very hard to build an international coalition against this particular terrorist group and against terrorism. Article 5 in the NATO Accords means that if any one member of NATO is attacked, then the others respond as well. And obviously it doesn't, the United States is not eager to go out one-on-one against this terrorist group, not because it doesn't feel it can handle this particular group of terrorists, but it wants to make clear to the rest of the world that this is not the United States against terrorism, that it's free-thinking people everywhere against terrorism. NBC's Brian Williams joins me now. He's been talking with people at the White House. And Brian, you have some new information on what the other possible targets could have been yesterday, including the White House?
Tom, indeed. White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer told me by telephone just a few minutes ago that for a time yesterday, not only was the flying White House, Air Force One, a target of the terrorists, not only did it have to fly a zigzag route from the president's school event to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Not only did it have these, as you see the F-16 off the left wing, these jet escorts, but the White House is saying, again through Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, that there is credible evidence that the aircraft that crashed at the Pentagon was headed for the White House. The initial target was the White House, but in the end, that flight plan could not be executed. It veered, went, as you know, the short distance across the Potomac and slammed into one of the sides of the Pentagon, eventually collapsing it. So again, the aircraft carrying the president yesterday, the White House, were both targets. According to the White House, they say there is credible evidence pointing to both of these. Now, there is a subplot here, a lot of it laid out in this morning's New York Times. The questions that came up during our live coverage for several hours yesterday: where was the president? Why was the president in an underground and secured bunker in Nebraska? The question posed rhetorically in this morning's New York Times: how could Mr. Bush appear in control and calm the nation from a bunker in Nebraska? Now, we did hear from Karen Hughes, who briefed the news media yesterday, but we did not see for a time the president and vice president. Ari Fleischer was angry on this point, saying that the White House deserved a little bit more discretion and patience and indulgence from the networks, that for this time they had to remain both figuratively and literally underground. Fleischer went on to say it was the height of responsibility to allege anything else. We had reported last night that there was a rather boisterous meeting on the Hill, that some senators of both parties expressed the desire, the need for the president to return to Washington. William Bennett quoted in this morning's New York Times as saying, "This is not 1812. It cannot look as if the president has been run off, or it will look like we can't defend our most important institutions." So some sensitivity at the White House today for those few hours that passed yesterday, the height of confusion really, and they are saying the reason is the very aircraft that carried the president and the president's home, the People's House, were both targets of this attack. It was only at the last minute that the aircraft veered off and struck the Pentagon instead. Tom?
Brian, what is the credible evidence that Air Force One could have been a target? These planes were some distance from Air Force One after all.
The excuse was that, quote, we do not discuss, we do not discuss intelligence information. Air Force One has been said to be a target in the past during President Clinton's trip to Bosnia during his first term, where they stopped in Aviano and switched out into 3 transport planes. Similarly, they were escorted by fighter jets, as they have in the past, while it is not routine. The White House insisting that the evidence was, and thus the zigzag flight path from Florida to Louisiana, the Air Force is insisting that the evidence is provable and credible that the aircraft and the White House were targets.
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Brian Williams. We do expect to hear from Ari Fleischer. He no doubt will be questioned about all of this momentarily. He's scheduled to appear in the White House press briefing room at about 3:30 today. Let's go to Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon. Jim, are you hearing any of that?
Absolutely, Tom. In fact, military officials tell NBC News that one reason it's believed that the White House was a target is that the plane, once it took off from Dulles and was diverted by the hijackers from its route to Los Angeles and headed back toward Washington, it actually apparently
past the Pentagon once. It went past the Pentagon, crossed the Potomac, and then, according to these officials, then took a route which essentially followed the mall that it circled up over the Capitol and then headed down toward the White House, in the direction of the White House. It's unclear, however, according to these officials I talked to, exactly why the pilot diverted and instead went to the Pentagon. According to one military official who's familiar with flying this size plane, if they're not expert at flying the plane, it's not always easy to get a plane this size to respond as readily as you would like. And it's quite possible that the pilot in his first attempt may not have been able to target the White House. That is obviously speculation on the part of military officials, Tom, but they do say that the plane, in fact, passed the Pentagon once, went over the Capitol, down in the region of the mall toward the White House, and eventually back, looped around again, and back and did a flip and pounded into the Pentagon. Tom?
All right, NBC Jim Miklaszewski and Brian Williams, those intriguing reports out of the White House that the White House was, in fact, a potential target of the hijacked airliners. There's still the open question, of course, what was going to happen to that United airliner that went down outside of Pittsburgh. It had left Newark. It was headed for San Francisco. It was turned around, presumably by the hijackers, and then it crashed into the ground. There's a strong possibility that there might have been a struggle on board. Maybe it was coming into Washington, and we can only guess about what target it may have in mind. At any rate, Ari Fleischer will be questioned about all of this during the course of his briefing at 3:30 this afternoon. As Brian pointed out, the White House is sensitive to these reports that have been raised both on Capitol Hill and in the press about the location of the president during yesterday's chaotic hours. He did go from Florida to Barksdale Air Force Base and then on to Omaha, Nebraska. Part of the problem during a time when this country is under attack, of course, is that there are so many false, indeed misleading reports, and we can only guess what the White House and national security advisors were responding to. That F-16 that is flying off the wing of Air Force One is en route back to Washington yesterday. We're showing you file tape now to show you the exceptional measures that were in place when the president returned to the nation's capital. And as Brian pointed out, there have been times when the president has flown overseas when he has received direct flight or escort, and they always have a cap in place when they're over friendly territory, that is NATO nations. They put up a squadron of planes that fly out of sight of Air Force One, but they're there to intercept anything that may get in their way. In fact, I remember being on Air Force One time with President Ford, and we were leaving Helsinki after a diplomatic meeting there, and he was headed for Poland, as I recall, and Air Force One kind of rocketed through Swedish airspace, and suddenly we looked out the plane's windows, and there were two Swedish fighter jets on either side of us, and they were waggling their wings, and it was not a friendly gesture. They wanted Air Force One, the principal carrier of the President of the United States, out of Swedish airspace as quickly as possible, and we were out of there in a short time after that. Let's go now to General Norman Schwarzkopf. And General Schwarzkopf, it's not surprising, I suppose, that the White House could very well have been a target yesterday.
No, not at all. You know, there are many plans in effect as to how we are going to continue to have national leadership in the event of an overwhelming attack against the United States. The President of the United States has to go someplace where he is in communication with everyone in order to make the correct decisions. And for anybody to say that, oh, well, he should have just flown on back to Washington while things were still in a state of great flux, I think is a big mistake.
You were listening to General Colin Powell, who's now the Secretary of State, talking about Article 5, the NATO article that says that if any one member of NATO is attacked, it's an attack on all the nations. This is going to be very critical for this country in the coming days to have an alliance around the world, but especially of our closest partners in the Western democracies of Europe.
Well, you're absolutely right. If they don't choose to support us, then it's going to be very difficult for us to go to other nations that we don't have that close a relationship with and ask them to support us. So that is the first and very, very important stepping stone.
The Secretary also pointed out that it's important to have that article so that we have fly-through capability in other nations' airspace. What other kinds of military support could NATO provide to the United States during an operation against the terrorists?
They could certainly provide us logistic support. They could let us use some of their transport ships. You know, there's a whole wide variety, anywhere from providing troops for defensive capability only versus offensive capability, all the way down to just overflight rights. Remember, I hope you remember the bombing raid on Libya, where France would not let us fly over France, and all the consternation that caused. I mean, so that's why these things are so important.
As I remember, those American fighter bombers lifted off from England and had to fly around France before they could get to Libya.
And expending huge amounts of fuel to get there, too. That's right.
All right, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who's going to be with us during the course of our coverage. We have heard now from Secretary of State Colin Powell, who talked about the attempt to build a coalition around the world and the resolve of the American people to get back to business as normal in this country, while at the same time conducting a war against not just this group of terrorists, but terrorism around the world, using that as a rallying cry as he attempts to build this coalition. He checked off for us the list of the foreign ministers that he's been in touch with, not just America's allies, but other people around the world as well. And he talked about President Bush's conversations with President Putin of Russia, and President Jiang Zemin of China, Prime Minister Chrétien of Canada, and our other closest allies, including President Chirac of France, who was scheduled to be in Washington next week. In fact, the pace of diplomatic meetings is picking up in this country. The president is scheduled to come to the United Nations in a short time. The economic summit is to be held, the industrial